Have you ever spent a fortune not just to buy a seat, but to buy respect only to be met with nothing but a cold shake of the head? Selina Hart knows exactly how that feels. It was a Monday morning when she boarded a first-class flight with a ticket worth more than some cars. She wasn't dressed in flashy designer clothes. She didn't bring a bodyguard, just a cardigan and a quiet, unassuming presence. But as she approached the boarding gate, a voice as cold as steel stopped her in her tracks. "Sorry, this cabin isn't for passengers like you." The whispers behind her felt like tiny needles. She probably booked the wrong seat, and just like that, a ticket meant to symbolize her right to be treated as an equal became nothing more than a worthless slip of paper. Selina didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply turned away, a single silent step, heavier than the weight of the entire sky. But this isn't the story of a woman humiliated. This is the story of a woman who refused to stay at the bottom. Because Selina knew when the world tries to push you out of the doors of power, you don't wait for someone to open them. You buy the entire house. And 48 hours later, the very people who dismissed her were forced to rise, just to bow their heads, because the woman who was denied a first-class seat bought the entire airline. This is the story of a storm that started as a breeze, and you'll want to stay to see how that storm sweeps away every last prejudice. If this story strikes a chord with you, hit like, share, and subscribe, because what comes next will keep you on the edge of your seat. Have you ever paid to buy respect, only to be handed back nothing but contempt? Not the loud, obvious kind, but the small, polite kind. An extra long glance up and down, a practiced smile that means nothing, the kind of contempt that cuts clean, so sharp you don't even feel the wound at first, only the deep, lingering ache. Selina Hart knows that feeling all too well. She wasn't just any woman. She was a black CEO, a woman who had clawed her way through layers of prejudice to sit at tables where the fate of companies, even entire markets, was decided. But that morning, on a flight from New York to Seattle, none of that mattered. Selina dressed simply a gray cardigan, black slacks, flats, no designer logos, no sparkling jewelry, no entourage. She looked like any other business traveler, exactly the kind of nothing special appearance she'd chosen on purpose. Sometimes, you just want to be smoke in a crowded room, not the fire. She rolled her carry-on to the first-class check-in. In front of her, a well-dressed white couple received deep bows and warm greetings from the staff. When it was her turn, Selina smiled and handed over her passport and e-ticket. The flight attendant gave her a once-over, gaze lingering on the cardigan longer than necessary, a silent judgment that said more than words ever could. "Sorry," the attendant said, voice cold as steel. "This cabin isn't for passengers like you." Selina raised an eyebrow. "This is a first-class ticket," she said evenly, her tone calm, steady. The woman didn't even glance at the ticket. "I think you should check with the economy desk." Behind Selina, a middle-aged white man chuckled just loud enough for everyone to hear. "She probably booked the wrong seat," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. Selina straightened her posture, holding the ticket closer to the attendant's face. "I think we can both read what's on this ticket." The ground manager walked over, sweeping his gaze over her like she was an item that didn't meet the store's standards. "Sorry," he repeated, echoing his colleague, "but this cabin isn't for passengers like you." That was when Selina realized here, money wasn't enough to buy respect. And the bitterest part, they truly believed they were in the right. She tightened her grip on her suitcase handle and gave them a faint, cold smile. "Perhaps I am in the wrong place," she said quietly. But in her mind, she added, "And this mistake will be corrected in ways you can't begin to imagine." From that moment, another question emerged. How would they react when they learned the woman they'd humiliated was about to become the owner of their entire airline? Selina held up the ticket like undeniable evidence. "This is a first-class ticket," she repeated slowly, as if speaking to people pretending not to hear. But what she received was a dismissive nod and an empty smile. "Yes, but you understand," the ground manager said, lowering his voice, though the tone cut just as hard. "First class is for special passengers." The heavy silence that followed pressed on her chest. Selina heard the lifeless rolling of her suitcase wheels on the floor, a sound reminding her that this space wasn't built to welcome her. Then the whispers began. The man behind her leaned toward the woman next to him. She probably booked it with points, and like a signal had been given. More fragments followed. "Doesn't really look like first class. Probably some upgrade. Look at those clothes." Selina heard every word, each one like a tiny blade, slicing through the armor she'd built after years of surviving in a world that never assumed someone like her belonged in these rooms. In this country, she thought, sometimes your skin color makes them forget that you can buy the whole room. And if you want, the whole building. And if necessary, the entire company employing these people who look at you like a beggar. She swallowed the thought in front of her. The attendant had already turned to greet another couple, welcoming them with the kind of warmth reserved for people who belonged. Selina stood there, a shadow in a brightly lit room. She took a deep breath. "Can you call a higher-level manager?" The man in front of her raised his eyebrows and shook his head slightly. "That won't be necessary. We know how to do our jobs." He said it with the confidence of someone who always believed the power was on his side. Selina stared into his eyes, her cold smile widening slightly. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. What needed to be said would be spoken in the language they understood best: ownership. She turned, pulling her suitcase behind her. The sound of its wheels became a metronome in her mind, each step a silent promise. A promise that this would not end here. And as she walked away, under the watchful, judgmental eyes around her, she wondered if they knew the woman they just insulted could buy their entire airline. Would they still dare to look at her that way? Selina left the counter as if she were just another passenger abandoning a flight. No arguing, no shouting, no visible crack in her composure. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a blade quietly sharpened, ready to cut every thread of the game they thought they controlled. She paused briefly in the terminal, catching her reflection in the glass. A black woman in simple clothes, turned away from a world she had more than earned a right to enter. The glass became a mirror showing two versions of herself: the present, Selina silent, dismissed, and the Selina she knew herself to be the woman who could buy any room, if she chose to. Behind her, the sound of footsteps. It was the same man who'd mocked her earlier. He passed without a glance, but Selina caught it anyway, that look of entitlement, the gaze of someone who believed the world was his and for people like him. He disappeared into the employee hallway. Selina squinted. She knew that face. Then the memory clicked: Stephen Briggs' financial advisor to Richard Cross, the airline's CEO. A thin smile spread across her lips. Suddenly, this wasn't just personal humiliation. This was a message from people who thought she was just a second-class passenger to someone standing at the very edge of their power. Selina pulled her suitcase and walked out of the airport. Each step a quiet vow. She would return. Not just with another first-class ticket. As the taxi pulled away, she looked out the window at one of the airline's planes taking off, its silver wings slicing through the clouds. Selina chuckled softly. They had just refused her a seat on that plane. What they didn't know was that she was on her way to take far more than just a seat. She opened her phone, scrolled to a contact labeled simply "Fund," and pressed call. When the line picked up, her voice was clear. "Steady, accelerate the deal. I want controlling interest before the week's out." Silence isn't always about enduring. Sometimes silence is just pulling the rope tight until it snaps back and hits the hands that pulled it. And for the people who blocked her that morning, they were about to feel that snap. Because when someone refuses you a seat, sometimes, you don't just buy another ticket, you buy the whole plane. Selina sat alone in her hotel suite high above the city, a wall of glass stretching out into a canvas of Seattle. The damp afternoon clung to the skyline, the buildings shrouded in a thin mist as if the city itself was keeping its secrets. Orange light from the sinking sun washed across her face, catching the quiet storm in her eyes. The same gray cardigan she'd worn that morning still draped her shoulders, but now it felt like armor thin, understated, and impossible to pierce. She took a sip of tea, cold and bitter, dragging up memories she thought she'd buried long ago. When she was a little girl, her mother had taken her to a restaurant in Atlanta to celebrate a birthday with a rare special dinner. They stood at the host stand, waiting and waiting. No one came. When her mother finally approached, Selina remembered the manager's face, that polite but empty smile, the faint shake of the head, and the dismissive, "Sorry, we're fully booked," but the tables around them sat empty. 8-year-old Selina hadn't understood everything, but she'd felt it that sorry was never meant for them. Another time, at a bakery in an affluent neighborhood, her mother had been ignored while the customers behind them were welcomed with bright voices and warm smiles. Her mother said nothing, just paid for her order and walked out. On the way home, she'd said, "Selina, not everyone will see you, but you must always know you exist." Those memories bled back like old wounds reopening. As a child, Selina hadn't known how to respond except with silence. As an adult, she'd turned that silence into discipline, into a shell that kept her anger from erupting where it wouldn't serve her. But the airport that morning, that had been a punch through every layer of that shell. They hadn't just denied her a seat, they denied her existence on that plane, and more deeply, in the world they believed belonged only to people like them. Selina leaned her head back against the chair. "My mother would tell me to let it go," she murmured to herself. But if her mother were alive now, maybe she'd want to see her daughter do what she herself never could. She looked out over the city, the traffic below crisscrossing like veins in a living thing. One thought flared sharp in her mind. To remind them you exist. You don't always need to shout. You just have to do something they can't ignore. Selina set down her cup. Her eyes sharpened, like a blade coming out of its sheath. This time, she wouldn't choose silence to walk away. She'd choose silence to return, like a storm. And the people at that airport? They were about to find out what happens when a storm grows in silence. Selina rose, walking toward the glass wall, the city lights flickering to life beneath her like a second sky. She stared into her reflection and whispered, almost to herself, "Silence isn't weakness. It's stepping back to wind up the storm." How many times had she swallowed her words? How many times had her silence been mistaken for submission? They'd never understood that sometimes. The fiercest storms begin under the stillest skies. She turned back to the desk, opened her laptop. The wallpaper appeared a photo of the sky from the peak of Mount Kenya, where she and her mother had once climbed on a rare childhood trip. Her mother had told her then, "When you stand high enough, all the noise below becomes small." Tonight, those words returned not as comfort, but as command. Stand higher than those trying to drag you down. She scrolled through her contacts. The names of trusted advisors appeared, the ones who'd helped her win deals people called impossible. Selina stopped at one Anderson Fund. The phone barely rang twice before a deep, cautious voice answered. "Selina, what happened?" "It did," she said, her voice calm but sharp, "and now we'll make them regret it." She didn't mention the airport. She didn't need to. In her world, Anderson knew Selina didn't call at night over something trivial. "Accelerate the deal," she continued, each word slow, deliberate, a gavel striking down judgment. "I want controlling interest before the weekend." Silence. Then Anderson's voice, "All business now, I'll assemble the team. But Selina, this will shake the market." "Let it shake," Selina replied. "When the ground isn't stable, the roots rip out, and we'll plant them back the way we want." She ended the call, leaving the room in a heavy hush. But this wasn't the silence of rejection anymore. It was the silence of a strategist mapping her strike, of a storm waiting for the perfect moment to break. And somewhere out there, the people from the airport had no idea they weren't just bystanders anymore. They were the eye of the storm. Selina closed her laptop, letting the room darken until only the glow of the city filtered through the glass. She leaned back in her chair, fingers interlaced, holding onto a secret plan only she fully understood. In truth, this acquisition wasn't impulsive. Selina had been circling this airline for months, analyzing reports, listening to backroom whispers, cataloging shareholder complaints. She'd cast the net long ago. They just handed her a reason to tighten the pull. This morning's humiliation didn't weaken her. It turned patience into urgency. They thought they'd just turned away a simply dressed woman from a premium cabin. The truth, they'd accelerated a deal that could change their entire company's future. Selina chuckled, a sound of someone watching another dig their own grave without realizing it. Her mind flashed back to the smirking man behind her in line. She was certain now Stephen Briggs, the right hand of Richard Cross, the airline's CEO. Fate had a way of serving irony. They'd seen her, but they hadn't recognized her. "Interesting," Selina muttered, as if speaking to the reflection in the glass. She began pacing the room, her bare feet soft on the carpet, but every step thudded heavy in her chest. Outside, the city noise hummed on, oblivious. But in Richard Cross's world, everything was about to change. Selina stopped in front of the mirror. The face staring back was calm, but her eyes blazed not with mere anger, but with the fire of someone who knows they're about to seize control. "They'll regret it," she said aloud, tasting each word. Then a cold smile spread across her face. "They'll regret forgetting who I am." The silence reclaimed the room, but this wasn't the silence of humiliation. This was the silence of a loaded weapon waiting for its target. As for Richard Cross and his team, they had no idea the game they thought they were playing now belonged entirely to the woman they'd dismissed. Richard Cross wasn't the kind of man who knew how to stay passive. In 3 decades at the top, he had learned one thing. Power doesn't wait. It doesn't stay quiet. It dominates. So when his advisor Stephen Briggs reported that an investor had been quietly buying up shares of his airline, Richard's face turned red, as if someone had slapped him. "A black woman thinks she can take my company," Richard growled, each word ground out between his teeth. In the private boardroom, under the warm yellow light reflecting off expensive murals, no one dared meet his gaze. Briggs cleared his throat. "She appears to be aiming for real control, and we've confirmed it's Selina Hart." Richard laughed, a short, sharp laugh, with no humor, only contempt. "Selina Hart. I know her. The type of woman who climbs high only because someone lifted her. Don't tell me you actually think she can play this game at my level." But words alone weren't enough to bleed out his anger. Richard fought back by suffocating his enemies. He swiveled his chair, turning his back on Briggs and the other advisors. "I want every media channel we control working on this, tonight. Spread the word. Selina Hart is under investigation for financial fraud. Say she's using dirty money to buy shares." One advisor hesitated. "But if—" Richard cut him off. "No ifs. I want her name dragged through the mud by tomorrow morning. Don't hold back. Dig up her past work, relationships, Any old scandal the press ever wrote. And if you can't find it, make it up? Silence swallowed the room. They knew this tone, they'd seen it before. And they understood, when Richard Cross was in a rage, disagreement was the fastest way to dig your own grave. Richard rose, poured himself a glass of red wine, and took a slow sip, savoring a victory he believed was already his. "This is my company," he said, his voice low and sharp as a blade, and no one, especially someone like her, walks in without being taught a lesson. The plan was clear: attack her reputation, destroy her image, crush her before she could even strike. But what Richard didn't know was that the storm he thought he could smother with rumors was already big enough to sweep him away. Richard Cross didn't just run an airline. He built alliances like a spider spins webs. By the next morning, messages and emails were flying at lightning speed. Secret dinners in upscale restaurants, quick handshakes in the parking lots of investment firms, promises sweet as honey, with the cold bite of power hidden underneath. In just 2 days, Richard had pulled a group of major shareholders to his side. Some were bought with short-term gains. Some were simply too afraid of his name, Richard Cross. The man who had ruined entire careers with a single phone call. The board began to split in two, one half on Richard's side, the other silent, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. And in battles like this, silence wasn't neutral. It was waiting to join the winner. Then the media machine began to grind. A major financial paper ran the headline, "Selina Hart, Powerful CEO, or Using Dirty Money to Take Over." An economic news network opened its evening broadcast with sources say Selina Hart faces allegations of fraud. On social media, anonymous posts spread like wildfire, doctored photos, twisted personal details, fragments of old business stories, reshaped into weapons. From the outside, Selina was painted as greedy, dangerous. And in Richard's mind, that was all it would take. In business, reputation can put you on a throne or throw you in the dirt. Richard knew that. And he believed that if Selina looked dirty enough in public, the funds and shareholders still sitting on the fence would run from her like she carried a plague. In a closed-door meeting, one board member whispered, "You're playing too dangerously." "Richard, if she strikes back..." Richard cut him off with a smirk. "She won't strike back. People like Selina, they only know how to stay quiet and take it." He drained his wine, as if toasting his own victory. But there was one thing Richard Cross never understood about Selina Hart. She wasn't silent because she was scared. She was silent because she was preparing to rip the floor out from under his feet. As the media storm swirled, Selina's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Panicked advisors, hesitant investors pulling out, neutral shareholders demanding a clear explanation. She heard it all, didn't miss a single detail. But she didn't waste a breath explaining. When a nervous assistant asked, "Should we hold a press conference? Should we fight back in the media?" Selina finally looked up from her stack of documents. Her voice calm, flat, like still water. "Let him play his old game," she said. "I'll win with new rules." One simple sentence enough to quiet the entire room. She didn't explain. Selina never used words as her sharpest weapon. Her plans were sharper. She walked to the whiteboard covered in charts and shareholder lists. Names of familiar allies, people who had shaken Richard's hand, were now just pieces on her chessboard. "If he wants to make this a public smear war," Selina said, "we'll turn it into a game of real control, and when the rules change, the crowd won't even remember who said what in the press." A flicker of a smile. Not the polite, polished smile of business galas, but the smile of someone who just spotted a winning move on a board that everyone else thought she'd already lost. Selina thought back to the man on the plane, the one who chuckled when she was humiliated. At the time, it was just an annoyance. But when her internal team sent over the report, that annoyance clicked into place like a puzzle piece. Stephen Briggs, Richard's loyal advisor, sent to keep an eye on who was trying to intrude on their world. A quiet ah slipped from Selina's lips. Not surprise. Confirmation. They hadn't just disrespected her. They were watching her. For many, that would have been a warning sign. For Selina, it was fuel. If Richard thought humiliating her in front of Briggs was a first strike, he'd forgotten one thing. Selina never played a one-move game. She returned to the table, clasped her hands together. Good, she said. Let them think we're weak, because while they're busy laughing, we'll take everything they hold. In that moment, the room shifted. Fear gave way to something else. Belief. And somewhere in Richard's skyscraper, he still didn't know. The woman he had smeared was about to put her hands on the very empire he thought untouchable. The boardroom sat high above the city, sealed from the outside world. Thick curtains blocked out the evening light. Golden ceiling lamps cast their glow over a long ebony table, reflecting faces as cold and unreadable as the wood itself. Every handshake here carried no warmth, only calculation. Selina sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her gaze sweeping over each man present. They were representatives of a global investment fund, men who could pour hundreds of millions into a deal and still call it a small move on their bigger board. To them, everything was for sale: shares, companies, sometimes even people. Selina knew that. That's why she was here. We are not here to talk about today, she began, her voice clear, every word landing like a chess piece placed with purpose. We're here to talk about what will belong to you in the next 5 to 10 years. Oh. One of the men crossed his arms. His tone was cool. Sounds like you're selling us the future. Selina tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint, unreadable smile. I'm not selling, she said. I'm sharing. The bluntness made the room fall silent for a beat. She continued, I'm offering you long-term leverage, a place inside an airline that will soon change hands. In return, I need 15% of the stock, immediately. It was a high price. She knew it, and so did they. The man across from her tapped his finger lightly on the table. You want it fast, and you want a lot. What makes us believe this isn't just a reckless gamble? Selina leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her eyes locked on his, because I've never lost a bet, and this time, I'm not playing alone. She didn't mention that Richard Cross was now trapped in the web of his own media smear campaign, or that shareholders were panicking as stock prices bled out. They didn't need to know everything. They only needed to believe she could turn a short-term play into lasting power. The air thickened with silent math: risk, reward, cost. Selina also knew something else. Men like these were always drawn to the scent of a deal that could overturn an entire system. You have 24 hours, she said, rising to her feet, collecting her documents as though the meeting were already over. After that, this opportunity belongs to someone else. Eyes followed her as she walked out. No one spoke. But Selina knew she had just planted a seed, and once it took root, it would burn down the wall of power Richard Cross thought was unbreakable. Richard still didn't know. Didn't know that while he was busy dragging her name through the mud, Selina was buying the ground under his feet. She didn't wait for their answer. Time was pressure, and she wielded it like a blade. While they deliberated, Selina pulled on other strings in the web of power she had spent years weaving. A single encrypted message was sent. Not a threat, not a negotiation, just a file. Inside, detailed evidence of a long-buried environmental scandal Crossair had been hiding for years. Toxic chemical dumping at regional airports. Bribes to bypass inspections. Edited internal reports to conceal the truth. 1 week ago, those files were locked away in the hands of a small legal team and a few data analysts. Now, they were on the desk of one of the country's top investigative journalists, someone who lived for detonations like this. By morning, the headlines burned across every screen. Crossair faces major environmental destruction allegations. The article began with chilling numbers, tons of toxic waste released into vulnerable communities, and ended with a question that cut like a blade. Who will be held accountable? The media smelled blood. Television panels filled with environmental experts. Social media erupted with hashtags calling for boycotts. Big investors, those who usually only cared about profit, now faced a far greater threat, a stock price in free fall. On the trading floor, the ticker was a living nightmare. Crossair shares plummeted nearly 20% in 2 days. The board of directors scrambled into emergency meetings not to address the environmental damage but to protect their own money. In a closed-door session, one director slammed a report on the table. "We can't let this go on. If the stock drops any further, we're ruined." Another muttered grimly, "Maybe it's time we consider new leadership." Richard Cross slammed his palm against the table. "Someone's behind this," he growled. "And I'll find out who." But deep down, he knew in this world, when money starts bleeding out, loyalty is always the first thing to die. Selina watched it all unfold from her hotel suite, her expression calm, like someone observing a chess piece fall exactly where she wanted. She didn't need to make a move in public. The news, the market, and greed were doing the heavy lifting for her. And while the board trembled, scrambling for an escape, Selina knew it was time to turn their panic into her takeover. That night, she stood at the window, looking down at the glowing city, a living circuit board of power. The roads intertwined like veins, the buildings like organs. And at the heart of it, the market, where every beat was money, power, and fear. She smiled faintly. People think power is the sound of a gavel in a boardroom, a handshake recorded over wine and signatures. But real power is when you make an entire market tremble with just one message. That message had been sent 36 hours ago. A string of data, encrypted, delivered to the right hands at the perfect moment. And now, an entire system was swaying. Selina thought of her mother, the woman once ignored at service counters, told coldly, "I'm sorry, we're full." If her mother were alive, she might not understand the game being played here. But she would understand this: her daughter had learned how to turn silence into a killing strike. Selina sipped her coffee, not rushing. She enjoyed this feeling, the quiet moment when chaos lashes at everyone else, while she simply waits for the ship to tip her way. On her laptop screen, Crossair stock blinked red like an open wound. She closed her eyes, letting the memory of the airport return. The flight attendant's voice, "This cabin isn't for passengers like you." Stephen Briggs' mocking chuckle. The detached gaze of Richard Cross in every press photo she had ever seen. It all blurred together, not just personal humiliation, but a symbol of an old power. A power that saw her as an intruder in their world. "Fine," she murmured, almost to herself. "If your power is locked doors, mine will be the earthquake that brings the building down." Her phone buzzed. An email from the investment fund. "We agree. 15% equity. Funds transferred within 24 hours. Selina didn't smile. There was nothing to celebrate. This was just one move in a game she had been playing for a long time. But she knew this. Once this step was complete, no one could push her out of this game again. And while Richard Cross was still stomping out fires he thought were accidents, Selina had already set the whole forest ablaze. And she was holding the only map out. If the earlier strikes were just needles testing her response, this time Richard Cross fired the cannons. Within a week, Selina Hart's name blanketed every major headline. Clickbait after clickbait screamed across the media. powerful female CEO accused of laundering money to seize Crossair. Insiders claim Selina Hart has ties to shady offshore funds. The question remains, who really is Selina Hart? Television ran hourly updates. Experts were paraded onto panels, speculating about her motives, while opportunists on social media ripped her apart like vultures over carrion. Even decade-old anecdotes resurfaced a photo of Selina with a scandal-stained politician now blown up and twisted into something salacious. Open any platform then. Twitter, LinkedIn. Take your pick and you'd see the flood of comment. Exactly the kind of person who'd do anything for power. This is why women shouldn't control big corporations. Who does she think she is going up against? Richard Cross? Selina watched it all like a storm viewed safely from behind glass. She didn't flinch. She didn't issue statements. Because she knew the more you fight a mob with words, the more you feed it reasons to scream louder. Then came the next blow. The lawsuit? Richard wasn't content to smear her name. He wanted to freeze every asset she was using to buy up Crossair stock. The papers arrived one morning with a warning. If she didn't halt her takeover immediately, every file on the funds backing her would be dragged into the light. One of her younger advisors read the filing and turned pale. If he goes through with this, every transaction gets suspended. We won't be able to keep buying shares. Selina barely glanced at the stack of documents. She flipped through them like they were a dull quarterly report. Good, she said, placing them neatly back on the table. He's firing every bullet he has, which means he's starting to get scared. The room fell dead silent. The people at the table didn't say it out loud, but their eyes asked the same thing. Who stays this calm when their entire career is being shredded in public? Selina rose, adjusted her cardigan, and swept her gaze across the table. Let him sue, she said. When he's busy trying to drag me down, he won't notice that he's already sinking. In that moment, a few of them understood. Selina wasn't defending. She was turning his attacks into cover for the real strike. But the pressure didn't just come from the press or the courts. It seeped into her own team. People who once believed unwaveringly in her composure and strategy now sat in that brightly lit conference room, staring at one another, waiting for someone brave enough to say what they were all thinking. Finally, Anderson, the veteran advisor with a voice roughened by too many sleepless nights, spoke. Selina, should we pull back? Just a little ease the pressure. Prevent this from getting worse. It wasn't an unreasonable question. With Crossair stock in free fall, investment funds growing skeptical, and Richard's accusations escalating alongside legal threats. Pulling back sounded like the safe play. Selina scanned the room. Their eyes no longer carried the confidence she was used to. They were gripped by something else, fear. People who once wagered millions on her plan now sat wondering if they'd boarded a sinking ship. She crossed her arms, letting the silence press on them until the ticking of a pen against the table sounded deafening. Then, slowly, she spoke. Pull back. For what? To let Richard believe we're afraid. To hand him more power by showing him our weakness. No one answered. Selina stepped toward the massive screen displaying Crossair's plummeting stock. She pointed at it. This isn't a sign of our failure. It's proof he's losing control. Men like Richard don't file lawsuits when they're winning. They sue when they're scared. A younger advisor muttered, but if he wins the case, we lose everything. Selina turned, her eyes sharp as a blade. And if we retreat, we lose everything without him lifting a finger. Remember, our goal isn't to avoid the storm. It's to use the storm, to sink his ship first. The room went still. Then, slowly, the mood shifted. The fear dulled, the focus returned. As if she'd just pulled them out of the pit of panic and set them back on the battlefield. Selina straightened, her voice steady and ironclad. We don't retreat. Not now. Not ever. If we have to, we go straight through the eye of the storm." Some exhaled heavily as though hearing both a death sentence and a rallying cry. But they knew one thing. When Selina Hart said go through the storm, it meant she already saw the move that would leave Richard Cross in ashes before he even knew what hit him. The text came at midnight, while the city slept. Short. From a number she'd been waiting for. "We need to meet privately." The sender wasn't a stranger. He was one of Richard's most loyal shareholders, a man who once said publicly, "Selina Hart will never have a seat at this table." And now he was opening that door himself. They met in a quiet tea room, soft golden light draping over two faces filled with calculations. The man across from Selina looked tired, but in his eyes was the cold logic of someone who knew the tide was turning. "You know I'm risking everything," he began, rolling the teacup between his fingers to stretch the silence. Selina didn't rush. No one comes here without risk. But no one risks this much without seeing an escape route. He gave a small nod, acknowledging she'd read him perfectly. "Richard, he's losing control. And I can't go down with him. But you need to give me a reason to leave his ship." Selina didn't lure him with grand promises. She simply slid a slim folder across the table. "This is your reason. Long-term leverage. A seat on the new board. I'm not just pulling you off a sinking ship. I'm giving you a place on the vessel that's about to lead." He opened the folder, scanned a few pages, then exhaled a mix of relief and disgust at himself. "You really do know how to make yourself impossible to refuse." Selina sat upright, her gaze unwavering. "I don't force anyone. I just lay out the truth. Stay with Richard and drown with him. Or step across and keep your name intact when this is over." He closed the folder, tucked it into his briefcase. "I'll notify my lawyers. From now on, I'm with you." Selina allowed herself the faintest smile, not the loud, gloating grin of victory, but the quiet one of a player placing another vital piece exactly where it belonged. As she left the tea room, Selina knew she'd just done what Richard Cross would never see coming. She'd snapped the loyalty of one of his closest allies. And when one link breaks, the whole chain begins to rattle. And Richard Cross, he still slept soundly, unaware that in the dead of night, Selina Hart had just flipped his board to her side of the game. While Richard Cross was still scrambling to put out the media fire, Selina had already turned the chaos into her tool. Crosshair stock was in freefall, a nightmare for Richard, but for Selina, it opened the very window she had been waiting for. She didn't just buy shares. She did it the way only someone fluent in the game of power could, through shell companies, through proxy funds, tiny transactions, each too small to trigger alarms, yet together forming a tide that couldn't be stopped. In 4 days, those pieces clicked into place like a perfect puzzle. Anderson, her longtime advisor, placed a thick folder on the table. "We've done it," he said. "You have veto power now, and if you want, you can make them listen." Selina glanced at the numbers without a smile. Not because it wasn't worth celebrating, but because she knew this was only the overture. Control on paper meant nothing until it was translated into real power. And that meant facing Richard Cross directly. Across the battlefield, Richard finally realized what was happening. The stock crash he thought was a PR accident now revealed its true face. Someone had been quietly bleeding his company dry by taking it piece by piece. And that someone was no longer a faceless threat. He called an emergency meeting for Monday morning. The message wasn't an invitation, it was a command. 9 a.m. Sharp. No excuses. The boardroom on the 40th floor had never felt heavier. The directors, each of them now silently calculating their own survival, filed in with stiff faces. Richard sat at the head of the table, fingers interlocked, face flushed red though he was straining to appear composed. "We have a traitor," he began, his voice like a hammer. "Someone is buying this company right under our noses." One member asked cautiously, "Do you know who?" Richard slammed his palm against the table. "Selina Hart. And if we don't stop her now, this chair will be hers by next week." No one spoke. But they all understood this wasn't just about saving the company. This was Richard fighting for the survival of his empire. What Richard didn't know was that while he was summoning the board to stop Selina, she had already mapped out every move and planned to walk into that room in a way he could never imagine. Richard entered like the 40th floor was still his kingdom. Charcoal suit, deep red tie, each step on the wooden floor heavy enough to crush the tension out of the room. He stopped at the head of the table, adjusted his cufflinks, and tossed a smirk sharp enough to cut. "Selina Hart," he sneered, "always just a first-class passenger in the wrong seat. And now she thinks she can buy her way in here." His thin smile hung in the air. No one laughed. He scanned the table, eyes like knives, daring them to share his contempt. But the response was nothing more than a few shallow nods and eyes that refused to meet his. The board, once his unquestioning loyalists, now exchanged glances with each other. Nervous, restless, as if quietly wondering whether they'd backed the wrong man. Richard noticed, but pretended not to. "We're talking about someone who doesn't know her place," he growled. "Someone who thinks a few % of stock gives her the right to touch this throne. But let me remind you, this throne isn't for sale." One director, the same one Selina had secretly met last week, tapped his fingers restlessly on the table. Another, one of Richard's old allies, buried his eyes in his folder. No one spoke, but their silence was louder than rebellion. To Richard, this was just fear. To him, power always lived in reminding people they owed him their seats. What he didn't realize was that fear had shifted. The people in this room weren't afraid of Selina. They were afraid of betting on the wrong future. And in the game of power, when loyalty begins to crack, it never repairs itself. Richard leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "I want everyone to remember," he hissed. "Selina Hart is an outsider. She can't and will never be part of this board." No one answered. But that silence betrayed them all. Because a few in that room already knew the truth. Selina wasn't outside anymore. She was at the door, and they'd soon have to decide whether to open it. The sound of the door opening sliced through Richard's speech. No one had announced her, but every head turned toward the entrance. And there she was. Selina Hart. No gray cardigan today. A tailored black suit, a crisp white blouse, heels that struck the floor with deliberate authority. The light from the hallway cast across her face sharp, unforced, a presence that filled the room before she even spoke. She didn't hurry. She didn't glance at anyone but Richard. When she reached the table, she placed her briefcase down, opened it, and slid a thick folder neatly in front of him. "Richard," she said, her voice calm but slicing clean through the room's suffocating air. "You're right. I was a first-class passenger who got turned away." Richard let out a mocking laugh, ready to cut her off. But she raised a hand, silencing him. "But now," she continued, eyes locked on his, "I'm the chairwoman of this airline." The room froze. A few board members couldn't hide the flicker of relief and even satisfaction on their faces. Others sat perfectly still, like witnesses to a chessboard overturned with one move. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face, flushed with anger moments ago, drained of color. He looked around for support, but no one met his eyes. Selina leaned forward, resting one hand on the table, meeting him eye to eye. "We'll discuss how this company will be run. But first, let's agree on one thing. From this moment, the power in this room no longer belongs to you." She straightened, glanced at the board as if confirming an obvious truth. "Shall we begin?" No one objected. Some even nodded like they'd been waiting for this moment all along. Selina walked to the head of the table, to the chair Richard still occupied like a man nailed to it. She paused, extended a hand toward the seat, a quiet invitation for him to move. Richard didn't budge. "You can do this the easy way," Selina said, voice steady. "Or we can put it to a vote. Right now." The words hung in the air like a sentence. And in that silence, everyone understood. The power struggle Richard thought he was leading was already over the moment Selina Hart walked through that door. Selina didn't sit immediately. She remained standing, flipping through the documents she had brought in, each page turned with deliberate slowness as if savoring the silence before the storm. "Before we talk about the future," she began, her voice low but carrying, "we need to face what dragged this company to the bottom." Richard shot up. "You have no right." "Sit down," Selina cut in. Not loud, but sharp enough to rattle the air. And strangely, his body obeyed before his pride could catch up. He sat. Selina handed a folder to each board member. "These are copies of the internal reports Richard Cross hid from you. Reports about millions in hush payments to environmental regulators. Reports about shadow funds disguised as operating costs. And, of course, proof of illicit kickbacks to inspectors for covering up toxic waste scandals." The sound of shuffling paper filled the room like funeral drums. One board member, usually composed, whispered, "My God." Selina didn't pause. She projected charts and images onto the screen. Figures. Dates. Richard's signature on every document. This room, accustomed to glossy presentations and PR gloss, was now forced to stare at raw, ugly truth. "These aren't rumors," Selina said, her eyes sweeping across the table. "These are his signatures. This is the company you protected while he turned it into his personal weapon." Richard barked, "You're fabricating this to destroy me." Selina glanced at him, the faintest smirk tugging at her lips. "If it's fabricated..." "Richard, perhaps you'd like to explain why your signature is on every page." The room froze. A few members placed the folders back on the table as though the paper itself burned their hands. One whispered to another, "If this goes public, we're finished." Selina nodded slightly. "Exactly. And that's why we clean this up from the inside before the world does it for us." Richard tried to speak again, but every protest fell flat, drowned by the stares of a board no longer looking at him as their untouchable king. In that moment, Richard Cross realized. His throne wasn't being stolen in a coup. It was collapsing under the weight of his own sins. The documents on the table were knives, and no one wanted to be the one impaled. A board member Richard once considered loyal spoke first. "If this is all true, we have to reconsider this company's leadership." His tone was casual, but the calculation behind it was clear abandon ship before it sinks. Another member, once Richard's vocal supporter, slowly nodded. "We need to protect the company and ourselves." It was a signal. The murmurs spread. No longer whispers of agreement with Richard, but a current pulling against him. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "What are you doing? We built this together. You're letting some woman from nowhere burn it all down." No one answered. Selina stood still, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, watching their faces change. She knew exactly what was happening. The pack of wolves that once chased for Richard's scraps had smelled blood. And now they would leave him to die to save themselves. Richard turned desperately to his closest allies. "Briggs. You won't let them do this to me, right?" But Stephen Briggs, his most loyal confidant, kept his eyes glued to the documents like they were suddenly more interesting than their friendship. That was the moment Richard knew. He had no one. "You can't do this to me." His voice cracked, hoarse, strangled. "I'm the only thing keeping this ship from sinking." Selina stepped forward, her words deliberate, each one nailed into him like a coffin lid. "No, Richard. You're the stone dragging it under." Heads nodded. No one avoided her gaze this time. The boardroom had transformed into a courtroom. And Richard was the only defendant. He opened his mouth, but no words came. No supporters, no sympathy. Only cold chairs and faces already choosing self-preservation over him. Then, the quiet, steady voice of one of the oldest members. "We need a vote." It sealed the room like a verdict. Richard shot up, slamming his palm down in one last display of dominance. "You can't do this. I built this company. Without me, none of you would have anything." Selina didn't respond. She simply pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat. Not like a usurper, but like someone who had always belonged there. The secretary recorded the motion. The air thickened. One hand raised. Then another. Then another. Until the majority was undeniable. When it was done, the secretary's voice was as even as a judge's gavel. "Richard Cross is hereby removed as CEO, effective immediately. Control of the company transfers to the new chairwoman." Richard stood frozen, each word carved into his pride like a blade. He turned to Briggs, his last hope, but Briggs only shook his head, unable to meet his eyes. "You'll regret this," Richard rasped, and stormed out. The door slammed behind him, the sound of a reign ending in disgrace. Selina didn't watch him go. She adjusted herself in the chair, placing her hands on the table, eyes sweeping over the board these people who had just killed their king. "Now," she said, her voice calm but impossible to ignore. "Let's talk about pulling this company out of the pit he left it in." One board member cleared his throat. "Chairwoman Hart, where do we start?" Selina leaned back, settling into the seat like it had always been hers. "Start by making sure no one in this room forgets what just happened. And that from today forward. Crossair is no longer the playground of men who think they can play kings." No one spoke. But every nod in that room confirmed it. This wasn't just a leadership change. It was the beginning of a new regime. One where they no longer held the reins, but followed the woman they once dismissed as an outsider. That morning, at Crossair's first-class check-in counter, everything looked ordinary. Passengers lined up. Staff in pressed uniform smiled politely. The intercom droned overhead with its neutral announcements. But for Selina Hart, this was no longer a place to seek a seat, it was a stage. She appeared in an ivory suit, hair swept up, heels clicking sharp and deliberate against the polished floor. Two aides trailed behind her, though it was clear she didn't need them to make an impression. Her presence alone made people pause, as if they'd just realized exactly who was walking among them. Selina walked straight to the counter. No waiting, no hesitation. The flight attendant standing there, the very one who once scanned her up and down and said, "This cabin isn't for passengers like you," froze in place. For a moment, the two women locked eyes. Selina didn't say a word. But her gaze alone forced the other woman to relive it all. The humiliation. The laughter behind Selina's back. The assumption that she was just another outsider in the wrong place. The attendant swallowed hard, lowering her head. "Welcome, Chairwoman Hart. We are honored to serve you today." Selina tilted her head, a thin smile appearing. Not forgiveness. Not quite revenge. But the smile of someone who knew she had flipped the board entirely. She took her boarding pass, walked through the gate, and entered first class. Seat 2A, the very seat she had once been denied, was waiting for her. Cream leather, spacious legroom, a glass of fine wine ready on the side table. Selina placed her bag down and sat. not rushing to fasten her seatbelt. Instead, she let her eyes sweep the cabin. The staff now subdued, the passengers trying to guess who this woman was. Then she leaned back, slowly, as if reclaiming every ounce of dignity stolen from her that day. A different attendant approached, bowing slightly. "We would like to apologize for your previous experience, Chairwoman. All staff have undergone new training under the latest directives." Selina didn't respond. She simply raised her hand. "An espresso." The attendant nodded quickly and hurried away. Selina closed her eyes, breathing deeply. She wasn't just sitting in this seat. She had turned it into a symbol that real power isn't in the ticket, but in making the entire system bow when you return. But this wasn't just about sitting. She hadn't come back for a seat. She had come back to do what no rejected passenger was ever expected to do. Selina didn't stay seated. She stood, letting her fingers trail across the soft leather, testing it like a new purchase. This chair, once a symbol of rejection, was now nothing more than property. Hers to keep, change, or discard. A hard-to-read smile crossed her face. Then she turned and walked forward, heels clicking like a metronome of dominance. Passengers turned to stare, curiosity and confusion etched on their faces. One attendant tried to stop her. "Chairwoman Hart, please." Selina didn't break stride. She only tilted her head, giving the young woman a look so sharp it pushed her aside, clearing the path. The cockpit door came into view. Inside, two pilots turned, startled, as Selina stepped in. "Ma'am, this area is—" "Now," Selina interrupted, calm but cutting. "It belongs to me." No one argued. She walked up to the captain's seat, resting a hand lightly on its back, then turned to those frozen behind her. "That day," she began. Voice steady. "They denied me a seat. They said this cabin wasn't for passengers like me." A pause. Then Selina smiled the kind of smile that closes chapters. "When they deny you a seat..." Her eyes swept the room. "By the plane." No one breathed. From first class to the cockpit, the air stretched tight. Silent except for the soft hum of the engines warming up. Selina sat in the captain's chair. She didn't know how to fly a plane, but she knew how to control something far greater. Absolute power. She let the door close behind her, separating herself from the stairs outside. In that moment, Selina wasn't the humiliated passenger they once dismissed. She was the owner of the very sky they thought they controlled. But she wasn't done. She glanced at the control panel, already shaping a new plan, one that wouldn't just change a single airline, but the way an entire industry treated those they deemed outsiders. Selina folded her hands, listening to the steady pulse of the cockpit's beeps and lights. Every sound, every flicker, a reminder of the control she had seized. She remembered the attendant's scrutinizing look, the mocking laugh behind her, the face of Richard Cross in news photos. All symbols of a system built to keep people like her out. She touched the yoke lightly. Not as a pilot, as an owner inspecting her property. Then she looked at the door, the one that once kept her out. When they push you out of a door, she thought, don't beg to get back in. Build a whole building and make them knock to enter. The intercom clicked. This flight is preparing for takeoff. A simple announcement. But to Selina, it sounded like confirmation. The old chapter was closed. She stood, left the cockpit, and walked back through the cabin. Every pair of eyes followed her. Some curious, some fearful, all knowing. Selina stopped in first class, gazing at the place where it all began. No anger, no bitterness, only the calm of someone who had won on her own terms. Before leaving, she turned, her voice carrying like a final lesson. Respect isn't something you beg for. It's something you make the world pay at any cost. She walked away, leaving behind a cabin steeped in silence. A silence that told every person there one thing. Power had changed hands. Outside, the morning sun cut across the endless runway. Selina inhaled deeply, breathing in the air of a world she now walked through freely. Her story wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Because when someone dares to buy what once rejected them, they don't stop until the whole world changes how it treats those who don't belong. And as the engines roared in the distance, the scene faded to black, the quiet hum of victory echoing long after she was gone. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.